Good morning and welcome to Old Fort Niagara. I am Robert Emerson. I'm the Executive Director of the Old Fort Niagara Association. And today we're going to be talking about the American Revolution. And specifically, we're going to be looking at Loyalists who fled to Fort Niagara during the war. So why don't we get started with talking about what is a Loyalist? Well, a Loyalist was an American who thought that we would be better off as part of the British Empire. They basically opposed the revolution. They thought that things would be better if we remained under the authority of the king and parliament. So they were, some of them were passive and others were more active in their opposition to the American Revolution. Well, question is, we don't think about Loyalists very much when we talk about the Revolutionary War. We think of redcoats, we think of the Continental Army, battles, Lexington and Concord, and things like that. We don't think much about Loyalists. Why is that? Well, I'm sure you recognize this guy. I hope you do anyway. If you don't, I hope you have $1 on you. This, of course, is George Washington, leader of the Continental Army, first president of the United States, and called the father of his country. And he is well remembered. But we have to think about what would have happened if the revolution failed. And Washington might just be kind of a footnote in history. Now, here's another person we want to look at. And this man, I bet you don't know who he is because he was a Loyalist. As I said, largely forgotten people. Well, this is William Tryon. And he was an important man in his day. He was the last royal governor of the colony of New York. Again, he's unknown today. And we'll come back to him a little later. Now, when the revolution begins, of course, we're all familiar with, this is a pretty famous incident where the Patriots toppled a statue of King George III that stood in New York City. So there was quite a bit of opposition to Great Britain. It's a longer story that we're not going to go into here today. But one of the things that the Patriots knew in order to overthrow British rule, they were going to have to suppress Americans who wanted to remain loyal to the king. And so they set up, they set to taking over provincial and local governments. This was necessary in order to overthrow the existing order. So, Continental Congress in 1774 directed that localities set up committees of correspondence, later committees of safety, and these became shadow governments. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a cartoon sort of making fun of Committee of Safety, but the committees of safety became shadow governments, and later they actually took charge of running community affairs. And one of their duties was to suppress Loyalists in the community. Now, how did they do that? Let's go to the next slide. Well, they had various measures of suppressing Loyalists, starting off with fairly mild treatment and moving on up to this poor fellow here who's being tarred and feathered. First thing they could do is they could ask a Loyalist to sign a loyalty oath, not to the king, but to the new order. And if they refused to do that, or if they spoke in favor of the king or British rule, or if they helped recruit for the British cause, a number of other measures could be taken. They could be jailed. They could be put under house arrest. For more serious cases, there were instances of sort of vigilante mobs going out and really treating some of the more ardent loyalists with rough music, as they said, as we see here in this picture, loyalists being tarred and feathered. So in many communities, it was not comfortable to be a loyalist, to want to remain loyal to the king. So let's go to the next slide. Here we see some loyalists leaving their homes. This was an option. If you didn't want to be at the mercy of your rebellious neighbors, you could flee your home and go to some place where the British were in control. So let's go to the next slide. This is New York in 1775, and you can see the eastern part of the state is divided up into counties, and what's now Western New York was the territory of the Six Nations. And of course, Fort Niagara is up there in the upper left-hand corner. So Fort Niagara is deep in the country of the Six Nations. But I want you to look at the middle of the map, and there's a big county there called Tryon County. Guess who that was named for? They got rid of that name pretty quickly after the Revolution began. Tryon County was this huge county, and it was considered a frontier county. And through this county ran the Mohawk River. And the river ran through a valley, we call it the Mohawk Valley. And there were many, many loyalists living along the Mohawk Valley. And there were many patriots living along the Mohawk Valley as well. And sometimes neighbors were politically divided against each other. Some supported the king, some supported the Congress. And this could develop into a bitter feud. Politics literally divided neighbors. Sometimes politics, how you felt about independence, divided even families, family members fighting against each other. So what do loyalists in the Mohawk Valley do? Well, they have a couple of options. In 1776, the British captured New York City. So if you're a loyalist, you could go to New York City to be among the British, where the British Army is in control. The other option is to head west and go to Fort Niagara. Of course, you could go north into Canada as well. But for the purposes of today, we're just going to talk about the loyalists who went to Fort Niagara. Why did they go to Fort Niagara? Here's a watercolor showing what the fort looked like during the Revolutionary War. Its perspective is from the Canadian shore, showing some small sailing ships here in the foreground with the fort in the back. You can see the big building in the center. That's what we call the French castle today. So loyalists are coming to Fort Niagara because the British control it. Next slide. British Army is posted here at the time. It's 4 companies of the 8th Regiment of Foot. So the fort itself is controlled by British Redcoats. So this is why loyalists are going to flee to British-controlled territory here at Fort Niagara. Now, what we're going to see a video next that is about Patrick Gibbs. He's a loyalist who has been forced to flee his home in the Mohawk Valley and make his way through the woods, through the country of the Six Nations to Fort Niagara, where he hopes to find asylum for himself and his family. So let's go now to Patrick Gibbs in the year 1780.
I've walked these trails before. Not like this, though. Not with all my possessions strapped to my back. And not with my family, with all their possessions strapped to their backs. I walked them with my neighbors. Men I once called my friends. Now, look at us. Friends, huh? Never has a group been more poorly labeled. They are no friends of mine now, just rebels. We have no choice now. Pushed from our homes, our lives. I must provide for my family. I must provide the same things those people say they value most. Life, liberty, happiness, safety. Safety from those who fight for freedom. Niagara. The fortress there has a garrison of the king's troops. The Mackenzie family took refuge there last spring. Never would I have thought we'd suffer the same fate. Turned out and driven away, simply because we mind our own. Either you participate in their persecutions, or you become the enemy, no matter who you were before. But how could we stay? Me being forcibly disarmed, our farm being seized, Committee of Safety, another horribly named group. I heard the Mackenzie boys were seen carrying the king's guns, wearing green coats and traveling with a party of Seneca, undoubtedly off to pay a visit to our former friends. Our friends. Those people. Those who cast us off. People that we grew up with. Our children grew up with. Our families grew up with. Drove us from our homes. As if we were the enemy. We were not the enemy. They are.
So you saw Patrick Gibbs and his wife on the way, driven out of their home in the Mohawk Valley because of disagreements over politics with their neighbors. So they're headed to Fort Niagara through the woods. Let's talk a little bit about what happens to the Loyalists after they get to Fort Niagara. So at this point, we will go back to the slides. And we see the part of the British garrison here. This is a Butlers Ranger. And Butlers Rangers was a Loyalist unit that was based at Fort Niagara. What happened was some of these men who arrived at the fort, they were very angry at their rebel neighbors for driving them out. So they're going to join military units that are going to go back to the settlements and launch raids against those settlements. Butlers Rangers is probably one of the most famous Loyalist units, as I said, based here at Fort Niagara. Native Americans also were Loyalists. Some of them were Loyalists. This is an image of Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk war chief who very early on, he was an ardent Loyalist, supporting King George's cause. And he even went to England early in the war, and then came back, and he raised a group of volunteers, partially Native American, partially Anglo-American, and they went back and again raided the frontiers. So these joint raids were taking place beginning in 1777, going into 1778, 79. Actually, they lasted through the whole war after they began in 1777. And they would strike frontier communities. Some of the raids were very, very large, involving hundreds of Rangers and Native American warriors. Some of the raids were quite small, with just a small war party that would strike an isolated farmstead. And these raids really, they were centered in New York and Pennsylvania, but they were far, far more widespread than that. They went as far east as the Hudson Valley and as far west as into Kentucky. So this was a frontier war that was quite distressing to the Continental Congress and to General Washington. In 1779, Washington decided to counterattack, and he launched a raid in force against the country of the Six Nations. And he dispatched almost half his army to do this. So this shows how important Washington considered this frontier war to be. So the army invaded the country of the Six Nations. They laid waste to villages and crops. Most of the Six Nations, the people, were able to withdraw before the army arrived. The army was under the command of Generals Sullivan and Clinton. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. So where did these native people go when they were forced to leave their homeland? Many of them came to Fort Niagara. Go back one. This is a map by a man named John Luke, and this was drawn during the American Revolution. And it shows Fort Niagara. It's very crude, but it shows Fort Niagara. And if you look carefully outside the walls of Fort Niagara, there appear to be a whole bunch of huts and hovels. And these were shacks and shanties built by native people who were now refugees that came to Fort Niagara to get food and for support. Problem was that the British were unprepared for this influx of refugees. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have shelter to take care of their allies. There were over 5,000 native refugees gathered around the fort over the winter of 1779, 1780, and many of them either starved to death or died of exposure, just because it was a very rough winter and they had no food or they had no shelter, and the British were not prepared. So this map kind of shows a little bit of how this village of refugees that stretched for, in some cases, several miles, grew up outside Fort Niagara that winter. Now, the revolution ends in 1783. That's when the peace treaty is signed. So what are the Loyalists going to do? Are they going to be able to go home and go back to their farms? Let bygones be bygones. Well, that's not going to happen in many cases. One of the things that happened when a Loyalist left his farm and went and joined the British, he was considered an enemy. So a lot of times that farm would be sold, auctioned off, and the proceeds would be used to finance the Patriot cause. So they're not going to, many of them, most of them are not going to be able to return to their homes. So where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go to where the British are still in control. Many go to Canada. Some go back to Great Britain, but largely they end up in, at first they end up in refugee camps like the one pictured here. So today we saw a little bit about the Loyalists. We explained why. We don't know a whole lot about Loyalists. Most people don't. We explained why why people in the Mohawk Valley might have decided to leave their homes and come to Fort Niagara. We learned about them joining military units and going back and attacking their former neighbors. And we learned about how Washington's army responded to this, and ultimately what happened to the Loyalists that were here at the fort, had taken up arms in support of the king. So at this point, I think it's time for questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Okay, here's a good one. How many Loyalists were there in America? Well, John Adams, second president, estimated that a third of the people were Loyalists, and that's probably high, but most historians think that about 500,000 people were Loyalists. And that's about 20% of the population of North America in 1775. So that's a goodly number of people who wanted to remain loyal to the king. Okay. Oh, here's another one, a related question. How many Loyalists fled the country after the war? Well, about 40,000 people left the United States at the conclusion of the Revolution for various reasons. But most of the Loyalists wanted to, as I said before, live under British rule.
Could you speak a little about the Hessians?
I can. Hessians were German troops. At the beginning of the war, the British did not have enough soldiers to subdue the rebellion. And they were looking everywhere for soldiers. And in the 18th century, the House of Hanover was on the throne of Britain. So there were many, many blood ties between the King of England and German princes. Germany was not a single country at that time. It was made up of over 300 little countries. And each one of these little countries, in some cases, had their own army. So King George used his connections, and sometimes with relatives, to hire what were called German auxiliaries. They're not really mercenaries, individual soldiers who fight for money. They were auxiliaries. And about a third of the British force that served here in North America were called Hessians. And that comes from the largest number of troops that were sent over came from a state called Hesse-Kassel. So that term Hessians really applied to all of the German troops, although they came from other states as well. So the Hessians played an important part in the war.
Ryan has a question.
Am I unmuted? Okay, I was just wondering again, because I was seeing about uniforms. I mean, so that you mentioned about the Butlers Rangers, but the problem is there's like two variations in the web about them. I'm wondering which one's the correct one.
You might want to repeat that question, please, Ryan.
Oh, sorry. Basically, there's two variations of the Butlers Rangers uniforms. I'm wondering which one's the correct one.
Well, yeah, people used to think that Butlers Rangers were uniformed in green uniform coats with red lapels, collar, and cuffs, collectively known as facings. And for many, many years, that was the interpretation. You'll still see a lot of images of that. More recent research has indicated that people went into historical records and found out what kind of cloth was being purchased for Butlers Rangers. And it turns out that we think today that at least at some point the coats were green, but the facings were actually white. So the image that you saw today in our program reflects more of that contemporary view, what we think today is true.
David Martin has a question.
More of a comment than a question. The Loyalists might be forgotten in the United States, but they're alive in Canada. I mean, the official motto of the province of Ontario across the river is ut incepit fidelis sic permanent. Loyal she began, loyal she remains. And the descendants of the Loyalists are allowed to write UEL after their names. I don't know if any still do, but they're officially allowed to. UEL stands for United Empire Loyalists.
Very good point. I once had the pleasure of attending a joint meeting of the UEL and the SAR. The SAR stands for Sons of the American Revolution. And there was not a food fight at dinner, I have to say. They all get along very well now, the UEL and the SAR. But very good point, David. Thank you. All right. Where did the Loyalists go after the war? We talked about them leaving the United States and going to Canada. A lot of them were resettled in Nova Scotia. Some were resettled in Quebec. About maybe 800 initially were settled opposite the fort at Niagara, and some went to Detroit. So the 800 or so that were resettled here at Niagara, they were really the genesis of Upper Canada. So they are over around Niagara on the Lake today. That became sort of the kernel from which the Loyalist settlements here grew opposite the fort.
Lou has a question.
Go ahead, bud. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Who won the battle when Washington sent almost half of his army? Who won that battle?
That is a really, really good question. Thank you. People don't agree about who won that whole campaign. Different historians think different things about it. Certainly, the campaign under Sullivan and Clinton was a tactical success. That means on the ground, actually in the fighting, the American army was able to go pretty much deep into Six Nations territory. They accomplished their objectives. They did fight at least one major pitched battle at a place called Newtown, which is down Binghamton area, close to the Pennsylvania border. And that was a success. The Americans won and drove the British and the Loyalists and the natives away. So tactically, meaning on the ground, the American army was successful. So let's talk about the bigger picture and a still bigger picture. Did this campaign put the Six Nations out of the war? Did it make them sue for peace? The answer is no. In fact, they went, when they came to Fort Niagara, they're now even more dependent on the British for their livelihoods. So what they're going to do the next year in 1780, they're going to go back to the frontiers, and the raids are going to become even worse. So in the midterm of the war, it did not put the Six Nations out of the war. And so you could say that from that perspective, it did not succeed. However, the even bigger picture is this, and you know, who really lost this frontier war was the Six Nations, because while they inflicted great harm on the American frontier, when the end of the war came, and they were allies with the British, but at the end of the war, the British did not stick up for them at the peace table and defend their land claims. So when the war is over, they are no longer the powerful independent group that they were before. They're more dependent on the British, and the British literally do not support them. And you know, settlement comes and eventually, you know, comes into Western New York. Okay, here's a good question. After the Revolution, was Fort Niagara taken over by the United States? Well, in the peace treaty that ended the revolution, 1783, the border was set pretty much along the Great Lakes. So Fort Niagara, Detroit, a lot of these border fortifications were supposed to come to the US, but there were still disputes between the new United States and the British. There were disputes over settlements for Loyalists, etc., things like that. So until those disputes got settled, the British held on to some of the forts that were considered on the US side, and Fort Niagara was one of them. It took another treaty in 1794. By this time, the British are embroiled in a new war with France, so they decide to settle up, and in 1796, the US takes over the fort. But it took 13 years from the time the revolution ended until the United States actually occupied Fort Niagara. All right, so I think we're out of time. We very much appreciate you visiting with us today, and check us out. This will be going up on our website pretty soon, and YouTube. So have a good day, stay safe, stay healthy. So long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. This is a really great series.
Thank you.
So long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.